There are ways to kind of create energy in the body, even in the context of mold or chronic infections, right? We can do some adrenal support, we can do some mitochondrial support. That will not cure them, but it will sure give them a leg up in the world and help them, again, make those next steps.
Welcome to the Advanced Women's Health Podcast, where we empower women with the latest insights and advice on holistic health. From cutting-edge medical research to practical wellness tips, our mission is to help you thrive at every stage of life. Join us as we explore topics ranging from hormonal balance and reproductive health to nutrition and mental well-being. Whether you're seeking solutions for a specific health concern or simply want to enhance your overall wellness, you're in the right place. Let's embark on this journey to better health together. This is the Advanced Women's Health Podcast. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Advanced Women's Health Podcast. I am so excited to talk to Dr. Andrea today from our Victoria location. Andrea is someone that when she came into the practice, one of my goals, I think I told you this, but I don't know. One of my goals was to really round out and provide different perspectives that we didn't have at the clinic. I think there is this component of with the courses that I have and with the teaching that I have and with all of those types of things, it's so easy to get siloed as a doctor. It's like, I am all some people know, right? And you coming in and having so many other people in the team now coming in, bringing a totally different perspective to a lot of cases is something I value so much. And I feel like you really do that. So today we're going to be diving into talking about mold and chronic illness. And then, of course, Dr. Andrea's story navigating naturopathic medicine. So I would love for you to intro yourself and tell us a little bit about who you are and what got you into naturopathic medicine.
Sure. So, hello, everyone. I must say, this is my first podcast. So, I'm very excited to be doing it with Sarah because it just feels like two friends communicating back and forth. So of course, there's the long story and a short story. I'm not going to give all the details of what brought me to naturopathic medicine, but I will say, yeah, as a naturopathic doctor, my own health experience has given me so much knowledge in how to approach patients and how to help patients and actually how to understand the body. I've been through a lot of these health issues myself. And so, when there's particular words that patients use, in particular, brain fog or fatigue, there's a whole other level to me that I understand how that's impacting their life kind of day to day and just how crappy it is at the end of the day. So my journey, I would say the most significant piece of my health journey that brought me into naturopathic medicine would be I went to India at 19 years old studying science. I was doing pre-medicine, right? I knew I wanted to be a doctor, but at that point, actually, naturopathic medicine wasn't on my radar at all. So I went to India as part of a social work project. So totally random, but the most beautiful experience ever. But, it's India. And of course, I ate on the streets a few times. I didn't really know much back then. I was a bit naive. Again, I was 19 in India. First place. So fast forward. Well, actually, it was 10 days there. I got really, really sick. And then, with some type of gut bug, right? What I know now is some sort of parasite. But anyway, so I was quite sick. And then I recovered and went on with my life. And I was on a cookie and coffee diet. So, like I said, I knew a ton about health back then. And, within 4 months of being back in Calgary and my wonderful balanced diet, add in a ton of stress and my gut just, I remember I would go to doctors and I would say, it feels like something's inside my gut eating away at my intestines. That's what it felt like. Generally, they're looking at those 5 markers and the same stool tests over and over and over again and told that everything is fine. It was about a 2-year period where, I lost a ton of weight. I think at some point I was 95 pounds. very tired, obviously. Yeah, had really low resilience for stress and for life. Anyways, eventually, I think I was in a class and I started talking to a woman in the class, and she was just doing this elective chemistry class. And she was going to the naturopathic school in Toronto at the time. And she said, "You should go see a naturopathic doctor." So I did. I went again. I was a student, didn't have a lot of money, and I went and I invested in my health. And I do remember thinking it was super weird at the time because, again, I had never, it was so outside the way I knew health and wellness at that point. And she was talking about herbs and changing my diet and all these things. But, I was desperate. And so I followed the advice. And again, after being sick and like so sick for so long, I think it was within 5 days, I felt so much better. And that was the point where I went, there's something to this. And, again, I didn't follow through as much with that treatment plan as I should have because I didn't, again, didn't have a ton of money at the time, didn't really understand the consequences if I didn't. So, so I ended up, not getting, anyways, I had to go back to another naturopath eventually. And yeah, eventually I kind of caught on that there's really something to this. And that was the beginning.
It's such a common story too that people have where they're in this experience that often. And I think this is something that I want to battle out and like I want to change. The naturopathic doctor is the very last option. It's like, I've been to all the other doctors. Now let's go the witch doctor route, right? Which is what happened in my life as well. And then you hit this place where those aha moments, that awareness changes everything about what you believe to be true about health and the body and the medical system and all these things. And so, yeah, it's such a common thing for people to experience. But I think what I want to show from the rooftops is you do not need to be on like death's door before you see a naturopathic doctor, but we're getting there. I see that shifting now, at least in practice.
Yeah, it's definitely becoming more normalized. And what you're doing with the podcast and just bringing awareness obviously goes a long way. And again, I'm from Saskatchewan. I was in Alberta at the time. It is even, we're different there. We're in BC. It's a bit more accepted. So thank goodness. But yeah, that's, hopefully people don't have to wait that long. And yes, not be so desperate because we can help much early on in that process.
So then where did the mold piece come in? Walk us through that. Because again, like you're one of the people that talks a lot about mold. And we've talked about this before so many times. Like everyone has mold. But like, if that's true, everyone has mold. And there's only certain people that manifest the symptoms in a big way. Walk us through that whole mold thing, where it was in your journey, when you started to recognize it, what those symptoms were, and then just kind of intro mold to people.
Sure. Well, and that's where the story gets longer and a bit more complicated. But just to touch on that, like likely I had mold exposure as a child. And, my health, like I was pretty healthy. I was very active. I was actually a competitive speed skater, super random, but super fun. Yeah, but I
Carmen
always,
was too.
sorry.
Carmen was too.
Oh, right on. Right on. I wonder if anyways, probably different. But I always just felt like a little more tired than I should for my age and for my level of activity. But anyway, so that could have also kind of set me up for why I got so sick in India. There is a potential connection there. But I think that journey started, the whole mold journey, really when I was in my second year of naturopathic school. I went to a music festival. It was right after board exams. And so, it's always the perfect storm. I was completely burnt out at the time. But I went to music festival, I got really sick and I never recovered. Yeah, and the major symptoms at that point were memory loss, significant brain fog, significant fatigue. I remember feeling dizzy, like it was just so intense. It was so intense and such a terrible quality of life. And so for the longest time, and again, there's layers to this, right? But the longest time I was thinking the whole time it was Lyme. And at some point in this process, I actually went to a Lyme conference and they said, if you get a flu in the summer, think Lyme. And so I tested and I treated for that. And I went, oh, okay, must be Lyme, which not that that's a simple process either. But even with Lyme treatment, I wasn't feeling better. If anything, I got worse and worse and worse. I remember at some point stopping, and I was at that point, I was on antibiotics, I was on a load of supplements, and I stopped, and it didn't feel right. Like I just knew something was wrong. And to be honest, at that point, I did a 4-day water fast. Like I was desperate, but I just felt like I needed everything. I didn't want to take any more supplements. I just felt toxic. And I did a 4-day water fast. I felt terrible. I felt so weak that whole time. I wish I knew about the fasting mimicking diet at that time, because to have a little bit of food would have changed everything. But anyways, I felt terrible for that time. And then when I started coming out of that, something had changed. Something had changed. That's when I really started to feel better. Again, there's so many points along the way, but I think when I started to recognize that it was mold was, yeah, I had some like obvious exposures. We had moved into a home. There was black mold on the back of the blinds. I came into the home instantly, nausea, fatigue. I would get like hot sweats, which, I'm not perimenopausal or menopausal. So something was up there. There was another point where I took my sister's camper, and after the weekend, I was just completely floored again, the brain fog, all of these mold. That's what I think mold type symptoms are: brain fog, fatigue, nausea. And of course, she told me after the fact, oh, we knew there was mold, but we just cleaned it up with a little bit of bleach and decided not to tell you. Thank you. Thank you. But actually, that was the best thing, because then what that alerted me to do is, you know what, I'm going to finally get a test for mold and see, what are my levels at, and really, really start to treat this.
So which test did you do, like, in that process? There's always so many questions, right, about testing, about mycotoxins, how they leave the body. Can you run us through that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah. So the most common tests are the mycotoxin, the urine tests. Mosaic is one lab out of the States that does it. They used to be Great Plains. And then there's US Biotech that has a mycotoxin test, and they just took over real time labs. Those are the two main mycotoxin, because that's testing for mycotoxins in the body, right? Of what you're secreting. Again, it gets complicated because some people don't secrete toxins that well. So, I do know some specialists, such as like Jill Krista. She's a big name in the States, that she'll run multiple tests on people. The mycotoxins can be pulled out of the tissue. But again, these tests aren't cheap. So generally what I like to use is the US Biotech one. So I did the Motox Complete. That's what it's called. I want to say it's like $700, but you're getting the mycotoxin levels. You're getting some, not heavy metals, but more just environmental toxins, and runs a few organic acids. So, it's not as good as the organic test or organic acids test from Mosaic, because that's more comprehensive. But again, it's giving you some points in terms of like how your body's metabolizing fatty acids, right? So it's giving some like mitochondrial dysfunction kind of clues. Also some clues as if there's dysbiosis, so an imbalance in the microbiome. So it's kind of a screening test for some of those imbalances that come along with mold. That's a good place to start, I'd say.
When we're looking at, like, the pros and cons of testing, because I know we talk about this a lot on our calls, right? Like, do you test for mold? Do you not test for mold? Even, like, what does that mycotoxin represent? Because I have patients that come in and they're like, am I colonized? Is that why it's here? Is this that it's mold that I was exposed to 10 years ago? Like, walk me through kind of the pros and cons of thinking about testing and what that looks like and all of those things. Because I know it's a big conversation, but I think it's an important one that we start to have a little bit more.
Well, again, someone who's been at this for very long, I've put a lot of money towards different health issues. I mean, my husband is probably so annoyed because, I have had thyroid issues, adrenal issues. I've had so many different
Yeah.
conditions
I hear ya.
that he kind of just doesn't even listen to me anymore. So I feel like getting a test was very validating. And finally, I was like, oh, okay, this is why. It just brings all the pieces together. But it also allowed me to go, okay, I'm putting everything in this basket. Again, it really makes sense to invest that, because it's not like the treatment is cheap. And also knowing like, how long you're going to be at this, I think having those results in front of you can be really helpful in terms of, yeah, what kind of level of support you're going to need. In terms of the pros and cons, yeah. So in terms of, it does get a bit tricky. I mean, symptoms, well, Jill Krista, again, she's the big mold literate doctor. She has a questionnaire on her website. So I do like to start there and have patients fill that out, and that can kind of give you a clue. Again, it's a good screening test. Oh, what else was I going to say about that? Yeah, it's a bit tricky in terms of like if it's current exposure or past exposure. And I think at the end of the day, like mycotoxin is probably the best way to see if that previous exposure is still presently, yes, if you're colonized. And to be honest, there is a few markers on it's the oat test, so the one from Mosaic, that actually help you understand if it's colonized or not. But oh, that's what I was going to say is using symptoms because when we're seeing more of these histamine type symptoms, which
Yeah.
mold and mast cell, like definitely huge connection there. We know at that point that there's been some colonization, right? And so that's kind of where we start to see more of those mast cell issues. So genetics are at play here too. Many of us aren't as good at detoxifying as others. But another piece is bile. I mean, that comes back to bile. I don't know if you're ready to talk about bile or if I answered your question well enough there.
No, it's so funny. So many people on her team were like, okay, let's just talk about the bio. Let's just get to the fun shit now. Like, let's do it. Right. But I do think it's a good segue, right? Because mold, oh God, mold is something I hear so much more. There's so much more in social, but I think it's the perfect area where awareness is not always helpful for people, right? Because I have all of these patients that feel like trash. They feel awful. And they're in this position where they felt so unwell for so long. And this is why we always go back to the matrix, right? Like, okay, fundamentally 5 to 7 causes of disease, how do you navigate it, etc. But I see so many people coming in being like, I know I'm colonized with mold. I took this mold detox protocol. I tested my house. Like I did all of these types of things and they end up feeling worse. And I get the intention behind it, but I do think this is an area we have to be more methodical. We have to take this seriously just because there is mold exposure so many different places. And yes, so many people have mold and not everyone has symptoms or not. Also, so many people have EBV and they have symptoms or not. We don't just go around doing, well, I guess some people do, but there's a lot more people doing mold protocols and getting sicker than people trying to do EBV protocols. So that's mono for anyone who's like, what the hell is she talking about? But these mono protocols. And so I do think it's really important to raise awareness, right? And one thing before we get into bile that I want you to talk about is the difference between colonized and not colonized, because I think there's a lot of people who are like, what the hell does that even mean? But we need to be taking this very seriously in how you're navigating it. This is not a short-term treatment. This is not something that you're going to take a couple antimicrobials and your bloating and gas is gone. Like you need to think about so many steps in the process, which maybe we can get into later in terms of detoxification and movement and all of those things. But for right now, and before we get into bile, let's chat a little bit about what colonization means. And I would also love to know, like, do you think you were colonized? How did you know? Run me through that.
Yeah. I'm glad you brought attention to the point of, yes, it's not just the simple like treat with antimicrobials or antifungals and you're onto the races. Like there's, yeah, it's much more complex than that. And again, it depends on how long it's been there. And talking about when we go back to bile, I think hopefully that will make more sense of that. In terms of colonization is, yes, people can be exposed to mold, but essentially their body's just detoxifying and then it's going out through the urine and they're not getting sick from the mold. But in terms of colonization, generally that's when we're starting to see it in the tissues, right? And generally the gut is a big place where we see that colonization. In some patients, the lungs as well, but generally the gut. And again, that's where those markers on the oat test, oh, sorry, the markers on the oat test can help in that sense. And so in terms of my journey, how I knew I was colonized, well, again, because I had these symptoms for so long, and that was whether I was in a moldy environment or not in a moldy environment. So, that would be a clue in terms of colonization, right? If you have these ongoing symptoms. What was that other question you asked? Just the steps in terms of
Yeah. So when we're looking at mold and colonization, so I think it's a good point, right? Like colonization is essentially, is it in your tissue? Is it affecting you all of the time? Or is it something that you don't feel good? So for example, I am mold sensitive. So when we were shopping for a house, we would walk into the house and I'd walk down to the basement first and I'd stand there and I'm like, nope, I am foggy. I don't feel good. Now I grew up in mold. Like to this day, my parents have mold in their home. It is better than it was, but there's mold there. It has flooded multiple times, typical country farmhouse situation, right? And so, but I would go in those basements and I'd feel again foggy, unwell, not great. But I would leave and with 10 minutes of fresh air, I was totally fine. And I think that's the difference for a lot of people is if you've ever been that person who walks into a basement and you're like, oh, I do not feel good, right? I'm foggy. I lose my words. I get weird symptoms, staticky symptoms, like whatever that looks like, nausea, digestive symptoms. If you've ever felt that, imagine feeling that all the time. And like that's one of the big distinguishing factors, I think, for people.
Yeah, I agree. And that actually reminded me, it was the first clinic that I worked in. I was there for about 2 years. And I had a patient who was very mold sensitive, and she would come in and she would start coughing. And she, at some point, she's like, you know that there's mold in this clinic, right? And that was like, again, another light bulb. I had it tested, and yeah, we had toxic mold. We had toxic mold there. And so getting out of the clinic, also obviously a huge part of my healing journey. But yes, when I was exposed, like it would take me 2 weeks to recover. And even when I would get back to that place of recovery, I still was unwell. I just wasn't as unwell. And then another thing that reminded me of was it really was, I could see throughout the month how much, especially that brain fog and that cognition changed. And so at the point where I was like, I was just too brain fogged to figure it out. And I think a lot of work that I learned through you, Sarah, like I've just, yeah, this learning through you has been so, so helpful in my own health journey, but obviously helping patients as well. Because I would have, 2 weeks out of the month that I'm like, I'm doing okay. Like, again, I wasn't doing great, but I was doing okay. And then it was before my period, for about a week before my period and a week after, that I couldn't cope. And then I had more of like the hot sweats and the brain fog. And it was very challenging, but now that's what I'm looking for in patients too, right? It's like to see those changes throughout the month. And now we know, or now I understand that there's more of a histamine component to that, right? And there may be, chronic infections and viruses at play as well, because mold is so immunosuppressive, so immunosuppressive. And especially in a post COVID world, what I must say is, again, whether it's COVID itself, COVID vaccines, if anything, it stirred up the pot. And so for some patients, they go, oh, I have these symptoms and it's all from COVID or it's all post COVID. But sometimes you have to take a step back and go, okay, well, what was kind of lurching in the background that the body was kind of
Yeah.
containing or coping with? And then all of a sudden they had COVID or multiple COVID vaccines. And then it just kind of unleashes the beast.
It's interesting too, because one of the things that we have seen, and I haven't talked too much about COVID on here. I think it's something we will do at some point, but there is still just like this weird conversations when you go public. But one of the things we talk about and we see is how much there can be changes in bile acid metabolism with COVID and the vaccine. We're seeing all of this lymphocytic colitis from bile acids. We're seeing all this diarrhea onset. We're seeing all of these thyroid and cortisol changes and all of that kind of stuff. So that transitions a little bit into the bile conversation. But what is your hypothesis about that? Essentially, like what's going on in those people who all that stuff got stirred up. Their immune system is not great in this post-COVID world, which is so many people, so many people. And their bile was affected because of it. Like I fundamentally believe the body's really smart and that there's a reason. And so I'm going to assume in my mind that there's a connection between those two things. But I would love for you to dive into the COVID bile thing, but then also the mold bile thing a little bit.
Well, you're probably more of an expert on the COVID bile piece. Like I learned a lot through you on that one. But that's the thing. It would have been nice to see like and understand where their bile function was at pre-COVID. Because right, it maybe just tipped the scales. But in terms of bile, like essentially mold bugs up the bile majorly, right? And so in terms of, the other pieces of mold, like essentially we see a lot of glutathione deficiency, right? And if you're not getting enough glutathione, that very much impacts bile. It impacts bile reabsorption in a big way. And a lot of
How does it do that?
there is glutathione receptors on bile acid transporters. I believe there's glutathione receptors. Same with vitamin A, I believe. So vitamin A deficiency as well can impact bile acid reabsorption. But in terms of, bile and mold, again, so if your body is so busy dealing with the mold toxin, right, and is using a lot of the glutathione up just to deal with that toxin, it really bugs up. I mean, this is getting really sciencey, so pretty boring.
We love a
Acetylation
sciencey.
pathways. It binds up these really critical pathways that, the body's really smart. These pathways are meant for detoxification, but if it's used all up for mold, then you're not going to be detoxing, hormones, for example. And this comes back, especially glucuronidation. That's how our hormones are metabolized, right? So when we're seeing these hormonal symptoms, and maybe, these are like symptoms of high estrogen, right? Where we're getting these heavier cycles. So that maybe come back to endometriosis, right? In some of those cases as well. But even in my case, like I think that fluctuating experience of mold throughout the month it comes back to bile and my body not processing the hormones efficiently. Kind of how I see it, anyways.
It's so fascinating how all of that plays out and how all of these different pieces are connected. You have mold, which is depleting one area of your body, and then that shows up in another area. And I think this is why I always say we do evidence informed care, not evidence based care, because our patients are not RCTs. They're not clinical trials, as we call them. RCTs is clinical trials. Our patients are people with super complex factors. And if we try to isolate and break them down into like one piece at a time, honestly, you just don't get the results at the end of the day. And so this is the perfect example of where someone comes in with brain fog, nausea, right? They got some skin symptoms. They're sick a lot. They don't know why. They're just sensitive to their environment. They have PMS, even though it's more than that. And so you would go to like 4 different places to get that type of support if you didn't have one doc looking at all of the different elements of your body. It's just it's so key. It's so key to everything.
Yeah, and honestly, I feel like I see a lot of perimenopause. There's a lot going on in that period, and people come in kind of looking for hormones to solve it all. And not to say that hormones won't be supportive, because I mean, estrogen and brain health is a huge connection there, but progesterone itself is a neurosteroid, so it can really, really help. Really help at as you're working on those more kind of root factors. Now, there's something that you said that I just wanted to go back to, because again, with mold, yeah, it's people can get a lot worse very easily. Going back again to my journey, at some point it was a colleague, because I was complaining about brain fog, and she just prescribed fluconazole. And so I did it. Again, desperate. I would have done anything. And actually, that was the first time. It was the first couple days of fluconazole. My brain, like a light went on and the fog lifted. It was amazing. But I think if I recall correctly, it lasted like 3 days. And then, I started to feel worse again. Connecting this back with bile, well, first of all, I know for me, it's tempting to get people feeling well quick. Like people come to me, they might have been sick for 20 years and like, I want them feeling better, in the next week.
Yeah.
And maybe that's my own personality, because I want to get better. And I got this for you. Like, we've got so many tools. And I think that's the hard part, but also the beauty of practice is figuring out which tools to apply first. And what is going to give, I know you call it like the win, right? What's going to give that patient a win so that they can see and actually have hope that they can feel a little bit better and be more open to taking those next steps, because it's a journey. And especially with mold, it's not a quick journey in any way. But in terms of like, yes, getting worse quickly, so it's, again, tempting to go to like the antimicrobial route or the antifungal route, because you go, well, okay, if I have mold toxins in my body, or I'm colonized with mold, then let's kill it. But it's taking a step back and looking, well, why do you have this in the first place? Why isn't your body able to process this in the first place, right? It's always why? Like take a step back, take a breath and ask
Yeah.
why. And sometimes that can just go on and on and on. But yeah, so that's going back to supporting the bile and ensuring that your body is effectively detoxifying this mold toxin, releasing it in the bile, and eliminating it through the gut. And not only just eliminating it through the bile in the gut, if there's nothing like there's not sufficient fiber in the gut or binders to actually grab onto that mold toxin, it can just be recycled in your body. And you just feel worse and worse and worse.
Yeah. Yeah. It's again, like this, I always joke everything goes back to constipation. Like we're all just full of shit. And so if we just take care of that, you recycle less. But did that play into the bile component? I would love, because we recycle bile as well, right? So is there a relationship between, because I don't want to over medicalize this, but you and I are really, really good at that. Sitting there and like elevating and elevating. But one of the treatments for mold that is sometimes done is a binder called cholestyramine. So it's essentially grabbing onto bile acids and pulling them through. But do you think there's a relationship between bile and mold, even just in that recirculation piece? If the bile is not getting out of the body and like, what does that look like? Because it's one of the things, if you Google it, they're like, oh, you need a binder, you need cholestyramine. So where does that all play together?
Some patients can feel worse with a binder too, because it can pull up too much if, again, they're
Yeah.
not eliminating. Like there's so many, you have their phase 1 detoxification, phase 2 detoxification, phase
Yeah.
3. So they all kind of have to be working and they all affect each other. And it's super complicated. But essentially, like the big nutrients that are so important are phosphatidylcholine, N-acetylcysteine, and taurine to really help ensure that everything's kind of moving along as it should, but also those other pathways I mentioned, like glucuronidation and acetylation. And so that comes back to the B vitamins. So sometimes it's very simple, especially B5, B1. But then methylation is important too. But if you support someone and you throw in a bunch of methylation factors and their other detoxification systems are stuck in another pathway, again, you can make someone worse. So it's starting with what I've learned and what I've learned to respect really is like, again, coming back like phosphatidylcholine, taurine, right? Really, really supportive and really, really gentle generally, but are kind of supporting and kind of unlocking some of those pathways that can really be impacting proper bile flow.
Today's episode is brought to you by none other than Advanced Women's Health. If you are interested in diving in deeper to your health, if you are finally ready to feel like yourself, and you are finally over hearing everything's normal, everything's fine, and you want a deeper dive into your healthcare, then we are here to help you. We are currently helping patients in British Columbia and Ontario, Canada. But don't worry, if you're in another province, still reach out, get added to the wait list as we expand coast to coast. We cannot wait to work with you. Check out the show notes for more information on how to get started.
So this is a bit of a personal question. I'm just really curious. So we'll see how this goes. So Andrea has two little ones. I have two little ones, but your kiddos are younger than mine. How did dealing with mold show up differently in pregnancy? Because there's a histamine component. There's this whole like pathway of elimination change that happens in pregnancy. You're breastfeeding, you lose a placenta, which is a storage. I'm just really curious. Like, did you notice a change in pregnancy and in that postpartum period with respect to your susceptibility to some of these things?
Yeah, so definitely first trimester is just hard. Like for I think most people, I just remember being kind of nauseous and tired. But for the rest of pregnancies, both of them, I actually felt quite good. And I think it's because I had finally all this progesterone and estrogen on board. And so my brain was just bathed in these hormones. And yeah, I felt quite good. And I want to say probably till about maybe 2 months postpartum, and that's when I started to feel a little bit of that brain fog come back. But, there had been an exposure in that time as well. So to be honest, it was more of a positive experience for me, and I do hear that, right? We can get a nice reset in pregnancy, but I don't exactly know how it can all interact. I do know mold toxins can go through the placenta. I do know they can go through the milk. I didn't let that stress me out too much. We live in a toxic world. So there's a lot of things you can get stressed out about. But thankfully, my children are super healthy and very resilient. So yeah, in my situation, I fared okay. But, I'm a naturopath. I went to naturopathic school. I went to many doctors along the way. So although I never knew it was mold, I was
Yeah.
always getting adrenal support, like IV support, detoxification support along the way. Even though it didn't all go well, it's not like I was without any care for many years. Like some patients come in and, right, this hasn't been addressed for at all in any capacity. So
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there you go. You just have to have more kids. Just knock them out, Andrea. You're just good to go.
no, well, now because I finally have treated mold properly, I feel quite good. And so my process, I think you mentioned that too, is kind of the steps that I did. And again, so tempting. I just wanted the antifungals. I just wanted to go to these heavy hitters, fluconazole being one or itraconazole. Because I am seeing a doctor myself who's been so helpful, but she had me really start to work on that detoxification piece or the bile. Even the LVG complex, I was put on that. So there's a little bit of ox bile in there and some beautiful herbs to help with bile production and flow and NAC, phosphatidylcholine. And I started to feel well, already just with that before adding on the antifungals. So and then once I added the antifungals, I was expecting die off because that was my experience in the past with any other time I did
Yeah.
that because I wasn't well supported, from the bile and detoxification standpoint. But I just felt good. I just felt actually amazing on them. So that's the thing, right? If you take your time and you do things properly, you don't have to feel terrible.
You don't have to like suffer to get well, which is, I think, some of the stories that we tell ourselves in the chronic illness world. But it was so funny. I remember, again, Andrea and I were both young moms and we're nerds. And so she's like, oh my gosh, this bile, are you using taurine? What's this compound? So, like, you can tell when people get excited when they're messaging about single nutrient interventions, right? It's always my fave. We do that so much on the back end. Like, we have team calls, but it'll also be, we all know what's going on with each other, right? So you'll be like, oh, did you try this? Have you done this? What's going on here? Like, it's so much fun in so many ways to work with such a big group of really smart people because you just nerd out so hard on things.
Well, yeah, but honestly, like I feel like so much of my intelligence or of my approach and what I can offer to patients that's different all comes from my personal experience. Like it's
Same, yeah.
just incredible. Like obviously, I've learned a lot about medicine along the way, and I will always continue to learn. But it's just nothing can match the personal experience and just how it affects your mental health and your life in so many ways. Like you kind of have to go through it to really see that.
Absolutely. And I think for me, when I look, figuring out insulin resistance, what's going on there, figuring out celiac disease, seeing the body's power to heal from that, not having a period for 5 years, getting it back, then dealing with chronic pain, figuring out what was going on, treating myself and not being in pain. Like, I don't think there is anything more powerful than that. I've actually just been talking to a lot of students and new grads lately. And one of them asked me, like, how are you confident in a room? And I was like, I'm so unequitable. Like, I won't fully swear on here just in case they're kid listening, because truthfully, what I do for a living and what I do with patients all day, every day, and you being the same, saved my life. So someone could yell in my face, this, what you do does not work. Someone could call me an absolute lunatic. Someone could, like, there could be research published that shows the opposite is true. And it's like a one-off study and everyone's kicking off about it because that happens all the time. I could give a flying F because I am so grounded in the fact that what we do works because of my own journey, right? And then because I see it with patients. And I think having that conviction, it doesn't make you a good doctor. Like, you can get people healthy without having gone through your own absolute health turmoil. But it changes the confidence and the energy in the room. It changes how long you're willing to get someone to stick with something, the rate at which you're going to go. It changes, like, sometimes you can exchange, and I don't talk about this very much, but you can exchange a win for confidence, right? Like, I always say, I want someone to have a 2 week win. I want them to feel a change in their body within 2 weeks. But there are some patients that I'm dealing with that have extremely severe pathologies. And so that confidence stands in the place of that win to keep them going because of how much we've been through. And I think there is something really important to that because, again, like if someone comes to me, I'm so confident that I can get them better that you're just like, okay, let's try, go this way, go this way. You like try 10 different little steps until you figure it out. And that's how you become a better doctor. But I think it's also people would abandon so early in people who have chronic unwellness, right? Because they try something and it didn't work within a month. And I think just having been through it for decades of our lives, you're like, You're good. Like, it's fine. Just take the next step. Just take the next step. We'll get there." And then at 3, at 6 months, they're like, "Oh, okay." Right? At 12 months, they're starting to feel like themselves. At 18 months, we're like, "Okay." At 2 years, you're rebuilding that resilience. And I'm not saying it has to take that long for everyone by any means. But if I have a patient in front of me with endo and fibro and chronic viruses and Lyme and digestive issues and PTSD because of all of this stuff, it's gonna be a hot minute, and I think it's okay to say that to people as well, like, we want to have you feeling better on this timeline, but it might just take a while, and it's not like I'm gonna see you every month, but just trust me, like, we're in this together, we'll get you where you need to go, and there's just a grace to saying that that comes with having been in the trenches, right?
Yeah, very much so. That also reminded me, at some point in this journey, I think I was 2 years into naturopathic medicine, like, I was ready to quit. Like, I had actually applied for a government job. I got I had the job, I was accepted, and I was at this place where I was just like, "Okay, what do I do here?" Just some stable income, but I just not only was I feeling unwell at that time, I had actually lost confidence in naturopathic medicine because, again, I had seen so many doctors, I had done so many things, and I wasn't feeling any better. There's a few things about that, and what I'll say is it's like no one knew at that point yet what the greater story was, right? And so there's always, I think we have so many resources. We can always make people better, but if you're not getting better or it's temporary, right? Then there's something missing. There's something, and of course, in my mind, I go, probably mold. Sorry, but probably well, if you live in BC anyways, just something to really, really consider.
Ontario's not different.
Yeah, yeah, it's unfortunately, it's all too common. But not only that, like in terms of, well, having an illness or being sick for a period of time, like made me change my life in a really beautiful way. Like it was the best thing that happened to me, right? Like it's just looking back, obviously, it was treacherous and there was so much suffering in that. But coming out of it and what I needed to really change, like beforehand, I was just someone I would just go, go, go until I dropped. Right. And I didn't know balance. I think I was in this fight or flight mode all the time. There was just pieces of my life that I don't know, it's my body like needed to slow me down in order for me to start looking at things a bit differently. And I needed to make changes around, the types of relationships that I had and, the clinics I was at and, whether I wanted to be working with these doctors or, was it serving me? Was it not? And so I had to let go of a lot of that and kind of really look at, well, what serves me and what lifts me up and what take away all the things that drained me essentially, which obviously you can't do all the time. But that was a really, I think, big part of my healing journey as well. Cause I mean, you can't just take all the supplements and be in like a really stressful situation, a really toxic situation in other ways, right? And expect that you can heal. Now, maybe you can, but it will take much longer. So there's always so many other components to consider.
Absolutely. So I think on that note, I would love to kind of wrap this conversation up in a little bow by talking about what the three big things you look at when you're navigating. And you are the like, I think it's mold doc. Like you're the one on the calls, you're like, yeah, we gotta look at mold. But when you're in this situation, as we have both been in, that is so challenging to keep going and to keep pushing and keep asking questions and just fundamentally continue to believe that your body has the ability to be well. I think like is one of the big things that's really hard to do when you're chronically sick is believe that you even have the capacity to be well again. What are some of the like 2 or 3 of the pieces that you outline in that room to help explain what that journey is gonna look like to someone and to kind of rebuild their confidence? I know it's a huge question, but just highlighting some of those things I would really like to do because I know so many people who listen to this podcast who message me on the back end, who comment on the posts, and they are feeling this way. And they do look to these resources to give them hope. Like I know so many people who are like, I just want to work with you because you've been sicker than I have. And so I feel like you could help me out here. But what do you say to patients in those rooms and what do you want people to hear?
Yeah, very good question. I think one of the first things I do, and again, this is because I've had this experience, I try and take the blame out. Some people come in the words they use when they're describing themselves. So like, oh, I'm just lazy and I just can't get stuff done. And they've totally internalized their illness as it's their personality and it's who they are essentially, right? And so I really like to kind of change that conversation around like, this is like your system has been under so much stress for so many years. And people understand mental emotional stress, but immunological stress and inflammatory stress, it's all the same. The body sees it all the same. And so I think when we have that conversation, I feel like people, first of all, feel validated, but they also start to see like, oh, wow. Like, yeah, this is not necessarily just my body. Actually, my body is pretty resilient. The fact that I could wake up in the morning and I've been dealing with this for so long, but there is another way. There is another way. And yeah, so that's kind of the first conversation. And I feel like I could just kind of see and feel people's nervous systems just, okay, right. So that's building trust that I understand that process. I think it's looking at, well, obviously their goals, but generally these people are coming in like it's just so fatigued. And so mitochondrial support is a big place, and it's meeting patients where they're at and looking at, well, you can't really eat better. You can't really exercise. You can't put, one step in front of the other if you have no energy. And there are ways to kind of create energy in the body, even in the context of mold or chronic infections, right? We can do some adrenal support, we can do some mitochondrial support. That will not cure them, but it will sure give them a leg up in the world and help them, again, make those next steps. So I try and bring more of the supportive things in the beginning. And then again, the bile conversations and I do IV therapy, I do injections. So for some patients, if that's something like all you have to do is come to me. You sit in my chair, I will do the work. If everyone could do IVs, I mean, it's such an amazing, especially in chronic illness, it can be so amazing because it can just help them get their systems out of that funk and they don't have to do any work but get to our office, right? So it can be a really big game changer. Again, not curative in itself, but it gives the system, the body, the nutrients and the capacity to deal with the steps that come later.
Yeah, I think that those 2 pieces together in of themselves, in someone who has taken 1,000 pills and "herks," quote unquote, or flared on every one of them, and they're so scared, and they're just really not sure what to do. Those pieces to say, "Okay, you know what? Let's just refill the tank." I always use that example, right? Like, let's just put some gas in the tank. Let's see where it goes from there, right? Like, support your body and then do like you and I talk a lot about Gupta and EMDR and like nervous system stuff. I think because we just both really like that and know the nervous system's piece, but even just acknowledging, yes, you're stressed, but is it mental, emotional, or is it a bigger thing? When I say that to people, you're right. Like you just see this drop in their body because they've been told for so long, you're stressed. And they're like, I am meditating. I went on a silent retreat. You know what I mean? Like so many of our patients try and do stress reduction because they think if they can just calm their mind, then eventually their bodies will come online. But that's not true when there's blood sugar dysregulation and inflammation and dysbiosis and liver stuff and gut stuff. And I was saying to a group, we have a group of newer practitioners that come in and I mentor them closely. And I was saying today, yeah, like when you're 20, when you're 25, when you're younger, you can balance your blood sugar, you can do a little kill of your gut. You know what I mean? Like you can take a Nervine, and chances are that is going to be 80% of the job. But as stuff collects and as health issues and things like that magnify and compound and compound and compound, those are still foundational pieces. But it's going to take longer and you're going to have to cycle back to things. And it's just, you just become a more layered onion. And so there is this beautiful component about naturopathic medicine with that ability to like peel those layers back and be like, "Oh, look, we're here again. We just hit cortisol again or blood sugar again," or whatever that looks like. But yeah, I think it's such an important thing.
Yeah, I'm so grateful, first of all, that I stuck with naturopath medicine. I'm so grateful that I found you, Sarah, because I think
So
yes.
grateful for you.
Yeah, I had to just plug you there. But you're so good at just bringing all the pieces together, and you're more of a geek than I am. I'll give you that. um, but I do love this stuff. It's true. I do. I geek out on all the connections, and I just get so fired up because, especially now that I'm feeling better, right? Like it sucked when I didn't feel well. Sometimes I felt worse than the patients I was seeing. I'm like, that's a little bit messed up, right? But at this point, I feel well, and I feel like I have those tools, and I understand things and the connections so much better. And yeah, just I think your training has helped me so much with that, kind of fill in a lot of those gaps. And my plan for this year is to do even more training around mold, because it is so ubiquitous and can be complicated, but maybe not as complicated as well. Again, when you address it appropriately and with the right steps, don't rush into the antifungals and whatnot, like we talked about.
Well, I love that. I think that's a perfect place to wrap up. You've now roasted meat. We've talked about all of these chronic disease pieces. It's such, yeah, I'm just so excited to bring this to the podcast. As I've said before, I force all of these people to come on here and share their brilliance. And I hope everyone listening is grateful that Andrea did her first podcast with us, because I know there are people who are going to just take away so much from this and feel so much more hope, which is what I want this to do.
That sounds lovely. I mean, yeah, hope is huge. Right? That's life-given. Hope is huge. So if I can provide hope for people, yeah, that makes me so happy.
Well, thank you everyone for listening. If you loved this episode, comment, let us know you want more of it. Leave us some notes wherever you're listening. And thank you so much. We will talk to you next time.
Take care. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you had as much fun as we did. And if you loved today's episode, share it with a friend and leave us a review. That is how we spread this message, and that is how we are going to revolutionize healthcare in Canada for women. Have a beautiful day and be well.